Chapter 589. They didn't expect this Wang Dan to be from the Wang family of Luochuan. His status wasn't low either. Although he wasn't the eldest son, he was the younger brother of the future head of the Wang family, Wang Yong. Of course, he was also Li Xian's brother-in-law. It was surprising that Li Xian's brother-in-law was hanging out with Qin Yu and the others. Furthermore, it seemed like this brother-in-law wasn't happy with Li Xian as his brother-in-law. There were too many people attending tonight's banquet. Not only were there officials and nobles from the capital, but their children were also included. After the court conference, the officials from all over the capital hadn't left yet. Naturally, the palace couldn't accommodate so many people. Most of them didn't have the right to enter. This included Qin Yu and many other hedonistic young masters in the capital. They could only eat and drink outside the palace. Even though the Wang family was one of the largest families in the Jing kingdom, the two juniors were only able to sit in a remote corner. If they moved a little further, they would be sitting outside the palace. Li Xian's seat was naturally in front. Although Li Yi didn't usually attend court, his position couldn't be measured by common sense. It was extremely close to the front. Perhaps someone had arranged it, but it was actually connected to Li Xian's. At this moment, there was no one in the main seat at the front. The dance in the center of the palace was extremely beautiful. Everyone was enjoying it while laughing and chatting. There weren't many days in the year when they could relax like this. In a certain corner of the hall, the young man named Wang Dan pouted his lips, his face full of arrogance. "Are you unhappy?" Wang Yong asked his younger brother. Wang Dan snorted coldly. It was clearly written on his face. Wang Yong knocked him on the head and said, "Even father values Uncle Li very much. What do you know at such a young age?" "He's a bad guy," Wang Dan said coldly as he glanced in a certain direction in the palace. "Bad guy?" The smile on Wang Yong's face disappeared. He said word by word, "Wang Dan, do you know who you are?" Wang Dan had never seen his elder brother show such an expression. His body trembled and his face paled. Wang Yong looked at him and said seriously, "What happened just now? Tell me in detail. Don't hide anything." Wang Dan shivered and said, It's big brother Qin and the others." A moment later, after listening to his story, Wang Yong looked at him with an unconcealable look of disappointment on his face and said, "Father and I had high hopes for you. I didn't expect you to be stimulated by such a clumsy method. You really disappoint me." Big brother Qin and the others." Wang Dan had just opened his mouth when Wang Yong waved his hand and said, "Putting aside the fact that they have ulterior motives, even if they are truly upright, they are still on the King of Shu's side. The King of Shu's failed marriage proposal to your sister has already set himself against our Wang clan. As the legitimate son of the Wang clan, don't tell me you haven't thought of these things?" Wang Dan curled her lips and said, "The King of Shu is no match for him." "Why did father?" "Shut up." Wang Yong's voice turned cold. Even the surrounding people looked over. Wang Dan immediately retracted his neck and didn't say another word. His Highness and County Uncle Li are outstanding talents of the younger generation. They are already famous in the capital at such a young age. What right do you have to say such words? Let's not talk about the academy and the science academy." After listening to his brother's story of Li Yi and Li Xian, Wang Dan's face revealed a shocked expression. He looked in a certain direction again. Was the cheap brother-in-law he had always looked down on and the unreasonable person he had just met so powerful? So what? In a few years, I'll be even more powerful than them. Wang Dan curled his lips and said, but his tone had already softened. "Let's not talk about a few years later." Wang Yong looked at him and said, "What you need to worry about is half a month later." "What?" Wang Dan turned his head and asked in confusion. "The family used a lot of resources to let you enter the mathematics academy without taking the exam." Wang Yong looked at him and said, "Half a month later will be the day of admission, and the supervisor of the academy is the guy you mentioned just now." Wang Dan's expression froze. He rubbed his slightly numb shoulder and looked in a certain direction in the hall. His heart fell into a bottomless abyss. It must be in this bowl. That's not right. There was nothing under this bowl just now. Dust or no magic like Sun Wukong? The hall was filled with singing and dancing. In a small area in front of them, there were screams and cheers coming from time to time. The proud Lolita came over with her younger brothers and sisters. They were shocked by Li Yi's close-up magic. It was nothing more than putting the beans under the bowl for them to guess, using some techniques to transfer the beans or making something out of nothing, making beans appear in the empty bowl. This kind of simple magic trick could only deceive children. When it was performed in front of Rui and second Miss Lu, it all ended in failure. The little princes and princesses were making a big scene. Although they were not the focus of the entire hall, many people had been paying attention to them. Okay. That's it for today. Go and play. The feeling of being stared at by so many people was a little strange. Li Yi waved his hand and kept the bowl. Seeing that there were no more spells to watch, the princes dispersed. Only that Sundra Loli and Yongning stayed behind. Why hasn't it started? Li Yi turned his head and looked at Li Xian. It was really boring to sit here. Compared to this, the capital outside must be more lively. The proud Lolita interrupted. Father is not feeling well. He is resting in the back hall. Li Yi sighed. He had planned to go watch the lantern show with Rui after this. The lantern show on the day of the Lantern Festival was far from the previous ones. If he missed it, he would have to wait until next year. He didn't know if the Empress had finished. Otherwise he could slip away in advance. With so many people, no one would notice if 1 or 2 people slipped away. With this thought in mind, an unfamiliar young man walked over and cupped his hands to Li Xian, saying, "Long time no see." Li Xian was startled, then returned the greeting, saying, "Your Highness Prince Qi, long time no see." The proud Lolita looked at the young man and asked in surprise, "Is it brother Prince Qi?" The young man smiled and said, "After a few years, Xianning has grown so tall." Prince Qi said a few words to the proud Lolita, then his gaze fell on Li Yi. He asked, "This must be Li Yi County Earl Li?" Li Yi stood up and cupped his hands, saying, "Greetings, Your Highness." County Earl Li is too polite. Prince Qi smiled and said, "Although I am not in the capital, I have heard of County Earl Li's deeds. County Earl Li is worthy of being an outstanding talent of the younger generation of our Jing Kingdom, a pillar of the country. I have long wanted to get to know you, but unfortunately, I can only meet you today." They were both princes, but this Prince Qi liked to speak the truth, leaving the hypocritical king of Shu far behind. Li Yi smiled and said, "You flatter me, Your Highness, you flatter me." Prince Qi poured a cup of wine and cupped his hands, saying, "County Earl Li has made many contributions to our Jing Kingdom. I admire you from the bottom of my heart. This cup of wine is to County Earl Li." Li Yi was startled, but he could only raise his cup. Although the Prince of Qi was not favored, he was still a genuine imperial prince. As soon as he walked over, quite a few gazes followed him. This time, King Shu lost his power and was sent away from the capital by His Majesty. He could not even return for the court meeting. The ones who benefited the most were naturally the other princes. Among the many princes, Prince Qi was one of the more respected ones in terms of status and background. Prince Qi made such a move under the watchful eyes of so many people. Was there any other meaning behind it? Could it be that he wanted to win over County Earl Li, who was favored by the emperor, and wanted to get the position of the Eastern Palace? Up to now, no one in the court dared to look down on this young county earl. However, all the officials who supported King Shu immediately became vigilant. After saying a few words and toasting, Prince Qi returned to his seat. However, Li Yi knew that Prince Qi did not just want to express his endless admiration for him. Of course, it was necessary to admire him. Apart from admiration, Prince Qi also wanted to win him over and help him fight for the throne. "Prince Qi wants to win you over," Li Xian said with a frown. Li Yi glanced at him. Even a fool could see through Prince Qi's intention. "Why does he want to win you over?" A puzzled expression appeared on Li Xian's face. "Aside from the academy, you don't have any real power or influence in the imperial court. You don't have much value, so why would he want to rope in someone who has no value?" "A worthless person," Li Yi smiled as he poured a cup of tea and took a sip. For some reason this smile made Li Xian shudder. In the brightly lit hall, there seemed to be a chilly wind blowing from a corner. Chapter 590. The banquet of the royal family was actually very boring. Everything had to be done in an orderly manner. Even conversations had to be done in hushed voices, including the performances in the hall. Although they were exciting, they were just a formality. During this period, the old emperor and empress came by once and said a few simple words. They left without even watching a part of the dance. It was as if they were treating today and everyone could eat and play as they pleased. All expenses would be deducted from the national treasury. The old emperor's health was really deteriorating day by day. If Li Yi's guess was correct, he must have forgotten who Lu Jimin was, let alone the imperial physician's instructions. With such a workaholic boss, the employees naturally couldn't be lazy. In the imperial court of the Jing Kingdom, there was almost no such thing as extravagance or slacking. After the old emperor left, the atmosphere in the hall became visibly livelier. At this time it was up to them to choose to continue watching the dance and chatting in the hall, or to go out and watch the lantern show in the garden. The arrogant Lolita brought Yongning out to play. Li also stood up and walked out. Li Xian hurriedly stood up and asked, "Where are you going?" "It's so stuffy here." "I'm going out for a walk," Li said casually. Li Xian also patted his clothes and stood up. "Then let's go together. I have a lot of things to ask you about the military rations." Li looked at him and asked, "What military rations? How do you seal the military rations? How do you store it?" Li Xian looked at him and asked doubtfully, "That day at the Shui residence you said it? Worthless people usually don't have a good memory." Li shook his head. "I've forgotten how to store the military rations. I don't understand." With that he walked out leisurely. Li Xian was stunned for a moment, then immediately chased after him. "Don't. Think carefully. I'm sure you'll remember. There were actually more seats outside the hall, extending out in a long line. More than 10 dancers danced in the wind, dancing elegantly." Li saw a few familiar faces as soon as he walked out of the door. Young Duke Qin and a few of his followers were sitting outside, freezing like dogs in the cold night wind. They sniffled, and when they saw Li walk out, their faces were filled with awkwardness, hatred, shame. Their expressions were rather complicated. Li glanced at them and didn't look again. There was no sense of accomplishment playing with these guys. He decided to go to Rui's place. The Empress had accompanied the old emperor just now. A group of imperial guards rushed past them with solemn expressions. Li Xian was just fretting over how to cure Li Yi's amnesia. He stopped one of them and asked, "Where are you going?" The imperial guard replied, "Replying to your highness, imperial consort Xianxia has lost her bracelet in the palace hall. This subordinate will bring people to investigate." Li was still surprised that a random guard knew Li Xian. After a moment of surprise, he waved his hand and said, "Let's go and take a look." "Look at what?" Li Xian asked curiously. "Watching the show." "You can't go in here." When Li Yi and Li Xian walked out of the hall, they were stopped by 2 guards. Li Xian took out a token from his waist and waved it in front of the guard. The imperial consort lost her bracelet. The Secret Intelligence Office is assisting in the investigation. If there is any delay, can you bear the responsibility? Your Highness, please. The guard recognized the token of the Secret Intelligence Office's commander. Although the hall was full of women and men were not allowed to enter, the situation was special. There was already a team of guards in front of them, so the people from the Secret Intelligence Office didn't dare to stop them. Inside the Jade Hall it was quiet. Imperial Consort Shui looked at the broken bracelet on the ground. Her face was pale. A maid knelt on the ground and said while trembling, "Your Highness, this has nothing to do with me. This bracelet just fell from her body." The maid turned around and pointed at the woman not far away. All of the capital's noble women in the hall looked over. That woman was standing there with a calm expression on her face. What happened was simple. The women gathered together to talk about women's topics, not national affairs. For example, Rui Lane had released a new perfume that was popular regardless of age. A few days ago he had spent a lot of money on a piece of jewelry that happened to be on clearance sale. It was worth the money. The rouge in the newly opened rouge shop in the capital was very good. After using it, he felt that he was very beautiful and so on and so forth. Just now the imperial consort showed everyone a jade bracelet. The jade bracelet was crystal clear, without a trace of impurity. It was extremely rare. As everyone knew, the largest jewelry shop in the Jing Kingdom was backed by the Chui family. Only imperial consort Chui could produce a jade bracelet of this quality. However, as the crowd passed it around, they talked. In the end, no one knew who it ended up in, but the jade bracelet mysteriously disappeared. None of the people present admitted that the jade bracelet was in their hands. This jade bracelet was so precious that it was rare in the world. Imperial consort Chui immediately sent someone to inform the imperial guards. However, before the imperial guards arrived, the maid rushed back and accidentally bumped into someone. An item slipped out of the sleeve of the woman she bumped into and fell to the ground. It was imperial consort Chui's jade bracelet. For a moment, the way everyone looked at the woman changed. Although the jade bracelet was good, everyone present was a person of status. Stealing something like that was indeed beneath their status. Moreover, the jade bracelet was now destroyed. Looking at imperial consort Chui's expression, today's matter would not be settled peacefully. I remember now. Imperial consort Chui's bracelet seemed to have been passed there. A woman said in a low voice. Who is this woman? I've never seen her before. The person next to her seems to be the crown princess of Prince Ning's family. That is the wife of County Earl Li. The perfume that everyone uses is from her family. No matter what, she is the County Earl's wife. How could she do such a despicable thing? It is really shameful. Countless whispers could be heard. Suddenly, a figure slowly walked out from the crowd. She looked at the maid and asked, Imperial Consort Shui and the other concubines are all here. Think carefully about what you should say and what you shouldn't say. Don't say a word of falsehood. Seeing the silver-haired, weak-looking woman stand out, many people's faces showed surprise. Didn't the Qin family and the Li family have deep enmity? At this moment, why would the third miss of the Qin family stand out to speak for her? At this moment, another person stood out and said, Sister Lu and I have been talking here. We can testify that she did not touch the jade bracelet at all. If it was only the third miss of the Qin family, it would not be a big deal. Now, even the crown princess of Prince Ning's family stood out to speak for her. The whispers in the hall suddenly became much quieter. This servant's words are all true. The maid stood up and pointed at the woman. She said, Even if I had the guts, I would not dare. Slap. A resounding slap rang out in the hall. The maid covered her face with her hand, her face filled with disbelief. The silver-haired woman's weak temperament suddenly disappeared. She looked at the maid with a sullen face. How dare you, lowly maid? The dignified county earl's wife is not someone you can casually slander. The third miss of the Qin family had a gentle temperament. Because of the incident 20 years ago, she had been hurt to this day. Most people present knew that. However, they never thought that the gentle third miss of the Qin family would have such a cold and harsh side. Chapter 591. Miao Yu. Several women of the Qin family who attended the banquet with her changed their expressions. They immediately came over and pulled her sleeves. The broken bracelet belonged to Imperial concubine Shui. The evidence pointed to the wife of Earl Li. If she stood up for her now, she would offend Imperial concubine Shui. The Qin family had been on the side of the king of Shu for a long time. Her current actions were likely to cause misunderstandings to Imperial concubine Shui. Whether it is slander or not, the truth will be revealed after the palace guards investigate. Imperial concubine Shui's expression had returned to calmness, but everyone could hear the suppressed anger in her voice. She looked down at the broken bracelet on the ground. As the legitimate daughter of the Chui family and an imperial concubine in the palace, even though she had seen all kinds of treasures, the destruction of this jade bracelet still made her very sad. What's more, the woman was the wife of Earl Li of Chang'an. Naturally, she would not let it go so easily. The silver-haired woman turned her head and looked at Rui, asking, Are you all right? I'm fine. Rui smiled and said, Thank you for just now. Imperial concubine Chui leaned over and said, Why is the bracelet here? Did someone deliberately frame you? Rui looked at the maid who was covering her face. The maid's eyes were slightly averted. The sound of orderly footsteps came from outside the door. A group of Imperial guards walked in quickly from outside. The leader of the Imperial guards walked straight to Imperial concubine Chui and said respectfully, Greetings, Imperial concubine. Imperial concubine Chui said coldly, Investigate carefully. I don't want to wrongly accuse anyone. You must find out who did it. Yes. The leader of the Imperial guards bowed and answered. I was just running over there and accidentally bumped into Madame Li. The bracelet fell out of her sleeve and broke. The maid recounted what had happened in front of the leader of the Imperial guards. The Imperial guards did not expect things to turn out like this. When someone passed the message just now, they just said that Imperial concubine Chui lost the bracelet and no one went out of the hall. As long as the palace maids or the harem maids searched everyone, it would be easy to find out who took Imperial concubine Chui's bracelet. However, there was no need to investigate now. Mrs. Li, is this true? He looked at the woman standing there and asked. He was a little hesitant. Everyone had heard of the famous county Earl Li. He didn't even care about the king of Shu and was favored by his majesty. If this matter was not handled well, it would be a big deal. Rui pointed to the maid and said, The bracelet fell out of her sleeve and fell to the ground. As soon as these words were spoken, there was silence in the hall. Even Imperial concubine Chui had a stunned expression on her face. That maid was the personal maid of noble consort Chui. Could it be that this maid stole the bracelet and accidentally broke it, so she simply framed Madame Li? Or could it be that she was simply following someone's orders to frame him? The former was naturally impossible. How could a mere maidservant have such guts? Once she was found out, she would not be able to survive in the imperial harem. Imperial concubine Chui's face was cold and she said, You mean that I deliberately framed you? It's obvious that you stole the bracelet. How dare you frame Imperial concubine Chui? A woman in a palace dress walked out from behind Imperial concubine Chui, pointed at Rui and said sternly, "It's obvious that you stole the bracelet. How dare you frame Imperial Concubine Shui?" A woman in palace attire walked out from behind Imperial Concubine Shui. She pointed at Rui and said sternly. Third Miss Chen walked in front of Rui, looked at the woman and said softly, "Princess Hui, this matter has not been decided yet. Please watch your words." "Princess Hui, let's wait for the result of this matter before saying these words." A beautiful woman in a palace dress beside Imperial Concubine Shui also said. "Princess Hui, let's wait for the result of this matter before saying these words." A beautiful lady in palace attire beside noble consort Shui also said. Princess Hui's expression changed. Even concubine Yen stood out, so she couldn't say anything else. Although her sister was an imperial concubine in the harem, other than the empress, His Majesty's most favored concubine was concubine Yen. If not for the Chui family, the title of imperial concubine would have fallen into someone else's hands at a young age. The guard leader hesitated for a moment and said, "Imperial concubine, I'm afraid this matter will have to be decided by His Majesty and Her Majesty the Empress." This matter involved Guifei Nyang and Li Xianbua's wife, so he couldn't make the decision. The Empress was the master of the harem, so it was appropriate for her to deal with the womenfolk. Moreover, the Empress and His Majesty were in the palace on the side, so they could report in a moment. What happened? A voice rang out from behind. The dozen or so imperial guards consciously opened up a path. When they saw the two young men walking in from outside, many people in the hall revealed looks of surprise. Li Xianbua. The guard leader walked over and immediately said, "Greetings, Your Highness." "Greetings, Li Xianbua." Seeing that familiar face, Third Miss Chen's face showed a trace of a complicated expression. Rui stood where she was, while the imperial concubine walked in the direction of Li Xian. What happened? Li looked at the guard leader and asked. "Your Excellency Li, it's like this." The guard leader described what just happened to him. "Is Li Xianbua? How did he get in? My wife did such a thing. I'm afraid Li Xianbua is going to lose face today." There was a burst of whispers in the hall and many people pointed at them. Concubine Chui looked at Li Yi with an unfathomable expression. "I see." After hearing the guard leader's words, Li Yi nodded and walked in front of the maid. The maid raised her head and avoided his eyes. She didn't dare to look at him. Slap. Li Yi slapped the maid's face, looked at her and asked coldly, "Who gave you the courage?" The strength of this slap was much greater than the previous one. The maid stumbled and fell to the ground, a trace of blood flowing from the corner of her mouth. The slap was crisp and then there was a long silence in the hall. Third Miss Chen's slap just now was because the maid was disrespectful to Countess Chen. Although her behavior was a bit extreme, even concubine Chui couldn't say anything. But County Uncle Li slapped concubine Chui fiercely in front of everyone. Didn't he look down on concubine Chui? "How dare you? How did you get in?" After a long time, a sharp voice finally sounded. Concubine Hui pointed at Li Yi and then pointed at the guards and said, "Is this a place where anyone can come in? Take him down quickly." The Secret Bureau is ordered by His Majesty to maintain the security of Hibiscus Garden tonight. Concubine Chui lost her bracelet, so we have to investigate it carefully. Li took out a plate and looked at the woman in the court dress and asked, "Auntie, may I ask who you are?" Auntie. The woman in the court dress opened her mouth and blushed. Several young women in the back couldn't help but cover their mouths and laugh. "Don't be rude." Third Miss Chin stepped forward and looked at him saying, "This is Concubine Hui." "So this is Concubine Hui. My apologies, my apologies." Li glanced at the woman and then cupped his hands to Concubine Chui saying, "Concubine Chui, don't worry. The Secret Bureau will definitely investigate this case clearly." Concubine Chui glanced at him and asked, "Oh, how are you going to investigate?" Li pointed at the maid and said, "This bold B** dared to steal Concubine Chui's bracelet and put the blame on others. Concubine Chui, don't worry. Even if she doesn't confess now, she will confess everything when she arrives at the Secret Bureau." Many people in the hall were stunned by his words. Li Xianbua was really unreasonable. He made a conclusion without even investigating. Whether the maid did it or not, when she arrived at the Secret Bureau, it was not up to her whether she confessed or not. Wasn't it too obvious that he was protecting Madame? It was said that Li Xianbua was arrogant because of the favor. Now he even looked down on Concubine Chui. Chapter 592. How dare you? Princess Hui's face turned red. She pointed at Li Yi and said, "How dare you twist right and wrong at will? This matter should be reported to His Majesty and let His Majesty decide." Li Yi waved his hand and said, "His Majesty is unwell and has already gone back to rest. The Secret Intelligence Office can handle such a small matter. I won't disturb His Majesty." Princess Hui snorted coldly and said, "Then keep him temporarily and wait for His Majesty's decision." Concubine Shui glanced at Princess Hui thoughtfully. "His Majesty and Her Majesty have arrived." At this moment, a eunuch's sharp and thin voice came from outside the door. "Greetings to His Majesty and Her Majesty." A group of women's voices suddenly sounded in the hall. Their voices were clear and melodious. Emperor Jing slowly walked in from outside the door with Her Majesty beside him and Princess Royal on the other side. When he walked into the hall and saw Li Yi and Li Xian, he was slightly stunned and asked, "Why are you two here?" Then he saw the Imperial Guards in the hall and asked again, "What happened here?" The leader of the Imperial Guards immediately stepped forward and said respectfully, "Your Majesty, just now." Her Majesty walked aside and talked to Prince Consort. Emingzu came over and looked at Li Yi. She lowered her voice and asked, "Did you cause trouble again?" Li Yi glanced at her. Did he look like a troublemaker? It was always trouble that provoked him. After hearing the words of the leader of the Imperial Guards, Emperor Jing's face darkened slightly. He looked back at Changde, who shook his head and said, "Impossible. How could a Grandmaster realm expert be knocked into by a maid and have something fall out of his sleeve? Even if it really fell out, it could be retrieved before the other party could react. There was no need to even think about it. The problem lay with the maid. In the eyes of all the women in the hall, His Majesty was the most impartial and selfless. No matter if County Earl Li's wife really stole or if the palace maid framed her, everything would come to light after His Majesty showed up. Under their gazes, the fair and impartial His Majesty walked in front of the maidservant and asked lightly, "Who ordered you to do this?" Princess Consort Hui's expression froze. Noble Consort Shui glanced at Emperor Jing, and the rest of the women also looked incredulous. Your Majesty." The maid's entire body was trembling, and even her voice was trembling. "I will ask you again. Who ordered you to do this?" The maid's face was ashen, and her whole body was shaking like a sieve. "Drag him out. Flog him 50 times before questioning him," Emperor Jing said faintly. The leader of the Imperial Guards obeyed the order and 2 Imperial Guards carried the maid out. Not long after, a miserable scream came from outside. "Your Majesty, this." Imperial concubine Shui walked out and pointed outside. She wanted to say something but hesitated. "I know what to do," Emperor Jing said. He glanced at Li Yi and Li Xian and said, "What are you two still doing here? Do you want me to add 2 more seats for you?" Li Yi and Li Xian were driven out by the old emperor before he could say a few words with Rui. He wanted to see what his concubines looked like, but he only saw Imperial concubine Shui. Although she was still charming, her mind was extremely vicious. This matter was most likely ordered by her. Imperial concubine Shui, right? The Shui family, right? These days he was a little itchy. There was still half a month before the enrollment of the Imperial College. He had plenty of time. Inside the palace, the Princess Royal Highness was surrounded by many women. Rui and the 3rd Miss of the Qin family were talking. The Empress was holding the Crown Princess's hand. No one knew what topic they were talking about, but it made her blush. Imperial concubine Shui sat next to Emperor Jing. She bowed and said, "It's all my fault. I almost ruined my sister's banquet." Emperor Jing waved his hand and said, "In the future, you have to take good care of the servants around you. Some people are becoming more and more bold." Another concubine next to him nodded and said, "I should take good care of the servants in the palace. Recently, a lot of the knight Emingzu that Your Majesty rewarded have gone missing. Jewelry has also been inexplicably lost. The servants by this concubine's side are rather clean." Imperial concubine Yen smiled. Only her palace had never lost anything. Shanning, that girl, always gave her some knight Emingzu or other jewelry. When the girl grew up, she knew how to be filial to her mother. However, a daughter was a daughter after all. She couldn't compare to Imperial concubine Qin, who gave birth to a good son. Prince Jean was young and intelligent. It was said that County Earl Li asked His Majesty to let Prince Jean be a teacher of the Imperial College. There were even rumors that County Earl Li, who was highly regarded by His Majesty, wanted to support Prince Jean as the emperor. Of course, these things had nothing to do with her. In a few years, her daughter would have a good husband. That was what she was concerned about. Not long after, the leader of the Imperial Guards came in from outside the hall and said, "Your Majesty," she confessed. The maid confessed very quickly. If there was no special favor other than the word punishment by flogging, Then this punishment by flogging was the standard punishment by flogging. 50 flogging was enough to beat an adult man half to death. As for those who were slightly weaker, they might not even be able to keep their lives. At the 10th flogging, she couldn't help but confess. The leader of the Imperial Guard said, she admitted that she was greedy for the Imperial concubine's bracelet. Originally, she planned to find a place to hide outside the hall, but she accidentally bumped into Lady Li, so she simply pushed all the blame onto Lady Li, this lowly maid. Imperial concubine Chui showed a trace of anger on her face. She waved her hand and said, how dare she do such a bold thing? Someone, drag her away and flog her to death. Emperor Jing waved his hand and said, today is the Lantern Festival. It's not appropriate to kill anyone. Flog her 100 times. If she is still alive, expel her from the palace. Yes, Your Majesty. After the leader of the Imperial Guards responded, he quickly walked out. His Majesty said that today was the Lantern Festival and it was not appropriate to kill anyone. Thus he couldn't really flog her to death. Although she could avoid the death penalty, she couldn't escape punishment. She stole the Imperial concubine's treasures and framed the county earl's wife. After this 100 flogging, she would most likely lose half of her life. She could only spend the rest of her life in bed. This lowly maid, how dare she? I was almost deceived by her just now. Yes, Madame Li seems to be a good person. She wouldn't do such a thing. The maids couldn't help but sigh in their hearts. His Majesty was really wise. With just a glance, he knew that it was the maid who framed Madame Li. And the County Earl Li, who was in the limelight, had more than just the Emperor's favor. After all, if he was seriously investigated, he was disrespectful to the Imperial concubine and defended Madame Li. However, how could a little maid dare to do such a bold thing? Moreover, she was the personal maid of Imperial concubine Chui. It was unknown whether there was any hidden story behind this matter. Your Majesty, I'm not feeling well. I'll leave first. Imperial concubine Chui stretched out her hand to support her forehead. There was a trace of tiredness in her voice. Emperor Jing looked at her and said, do you want to summon an imperial doctor? No, I just feel a little tired. I'll be fine after a short rest. Imperial concubine Chui shook her head slightly and said. Emperor Jing nodded. Imperial concubine Chui, followed by 2 maids, walked out of the hall. As soon as she stepped out of the hall, Princess Hui, who had a strong unwillingness on her face, also followed her out. There were many palaces in Hibiscus Garden. Important concubines such as the Empress, Imperial concubine, and concubine Yen all had their own palaces. At this time, in a palace somewhere, Imperial concubine Chui stood with her back facing the hall. Her face was cold and she didn't look tired at all. Princess Hui came in from outside and said with a little anger in her voice, what's the background of Li Yi? Why does he deserve His Majesty's favoritism? He obviously didn't investigate it strictly. Qin might have confessed under torture. Slap. A loud slap suddenly came from the hall. Princess Hui covered her burning face, and her eyes were full of disbelief. Sister, who allowed you to act on your own? Imperial concubine Chui looked at her with cold eyes and said coldly. Chapter 593. Sister, Princess Hui covered one side of her face and the other side was extremely pale. She looked away and said in a trembling voice. Imperial concubine Chui said coldly, Qin grew up in the Chui family and has been with me for more than 10 years. Before that, she took care of your daily life. Who else can order her around except you? Princess Hui lowered her head and said nothing for a long time. After a while, she suddenly gritted her teeth and a strong hatred appeared on her pale face. She said harshly, yes, it's me. I asked Qin to do this. A jade bracelet is nothing. I just want to ruin her reputation. This is just the beginning. They ruined my child. I want them to die a horrible death. What happened to Li Da? Imperial concubine Chui frowned and asked. After Da was flogged, he can no longer have sex. Princess Hui squeezed out a few words from between her teeth. Imperial concubine Chui frowned even more. After a while, she said in a low voice, stupid. The king of Shu was expelled from the capital city because of the last incident. He was not summoned to the imperial court this time. Their power in the court was also severely damaged. The Qin family's attitude was unclear, and Prime Minister Qin's party also began to waver. The influence on other officials was deeper. The Chui family and her plot for more than 10 years was almost destroyed. It was impossible for them to recover in a short time. What they could do now was to bear it. Even if their power in the court was severely damaged, they still had no rivals. The Chui family had an extremely strong foundation in the aristocrats, the court, and the people. No one, including the emperor, dared to underestimate them. It was simply a fool's dream for other princes to want to touch the East Palace. If they could maintain the original situation, they would win. But if they continued like before, they would be pushed into the abyss step by step. Imperial concubine Chui looked at her and said coldly, "This matter will come to an end. 1 year, at most 1 year. No matter who Li Yi is, you can do whatever you want to him. If he does such a stupid thing again and spoils my son's plan, don't blame me for being ruthless." When he said the last sentence, his tone was extremely harsh. "I got it." Princess Hui nodded, gritted her teeth and said, but the hatred in her eyes was still so strong that it could not be dispersed. "Royal Prince Duanyang can no longer have sex?" Li Yi was very shocked when he heard the news from Li Xian. Wasn't it supposed to be a wooden board? He was going to be beaten on his stomach, not lying down. How could he be injured? Where was he injured? Could it be that the blood capillaries were clogged due to fear, causing the blood vessels to be blocked and the peripheral nerves to die off, causing the cavernous body to die off? "It's already spread among the nobles in the capital. Don't you know?" Li Xian looked at him and asked. Li Yi shook his head. He had never known what the circle of the rich and powerful in the capital was like. Moreover, he had been staying at home to look after the child or accompany Rui for the past few months. He had no time to care about other people's business. It said that Prince Hui and Princess Consort Hui invited many skilled doctors, and even a few imperial physicians, but none of them were able to cure Royal Prince Duanyang. Li Xian sighed. For a man, this was already the greatest shame of his life. So pitiful. Although he couldn't empathize with them, they were both men. Even if Royal Prince Duanyang was a good-for-nothing, he was still pitiful in this matter. Li Yi also sighed and said, "Yeah, everything is fine now. It's all because of God's sin." Li Xian turned to look at him with a helpless expression on his face. "Don't you know who the culprit is?" Thinking of something, Li Yi looked at Li Xian and asked, "By the way, is that auntie just now Princess Consort Hui?" Li Xian nodded and said, "Yes, she is Princess Consort Hui, Royal Consort Chui's twin sister and Royal Prince Duanyang's mother. 2 sisters, one is a royal consort and the other is a princess. Is the Chui family really so powerful?" Li Yi asked again. Li Xian nodded and said, "In the entire Jing kingdom, the Chui family is considered one of the most influential families. It has been around for at least hundreds of years, and its influence is even greater. Except for the royal family, there are only a few families that can compete with the Chui family." Li Yi had learned about these families and the royal family before, but he didn't know as much as Li Xian did. More than 100 years ago, the aristocratic families were so powerful that even the royal family had to give way to them. Although they were not as prosperous as they were at that time, their foundation was still there. Without a proper reason, even the royal family couldn't afford to offend them. Of course, this didn't mean that the royal family couldn't touch them. It was just that those aristocratic families were too deeply rooted and had a great influence in the court and among the people. Even if the current emperor had always wanted to weaken the power of the aristocratic families, he had to take into account the stability of the people and couldn't take tough measures. Moreover, the relationship between aristocratic families and the royal family was also very complicated. There were many concubines in the palace, and almost every one of them had a certain power behind them. Royal Consort Chui represented the Chui family. Even the empress had a powerful family behind her that was not weaker than the Chui family. Concubine Yen, Concubine Qin, the concubines of various kings, and even Li Xian's own concubines. The entanglement of interests in this was not something that could be explained in a few simple words. The more he said, the more confused Li Yi felt. He shook his head and asked again, "The Chui family almost monopolized the jewelry business, so they must be very profitable. Compared with your father-in-law's family, which family is richer?" In the entire Jing kingdom, except for the royal family, no family is richer than the Wang family. However, for ordinary people, the wealth of the Chui family is still unimaginable. Li Yi nodded and said, "Then let's do it." "What for?" Li Xian raised his head and asked curiously. "Cheers." Li Yi raised the teacup in his hand and said. In the Jade Palace, an imperial guard soon brought the news that the bracelet was stolen by the maid of Royal Consort Chui. After the matter was exposed, she deliberately framed Countess Li and was severely punished by His Majesty. She was flogged 100 times. Her life was spared, but her ending was still miserable. Li was not surprised at all. Just now, Princess Hui had been trying to expose the matter to the old emperor, but she did not know that it was simply courting death. It was not good to frame anyone but to frame Rui. He wanted to ask Chang whether he had the ability to do so. The old emperor was suffering from asthma, not senile dementia. He was the one who had gotten himself into this mess. However, this piece of news was rather thought-provoking to others. A little maid stole the treasure of the royal consort and framed Countess Li. She must have eaten a bear's heart and a leopard's heart to dare to do so. The king of Shu had once offended Countess Li and was almost beaten to death in front of hundreds of officials. But now he could still live freely in Hibiscus Garden. Where was the king of Shu? The eldest son of the emperor, the prince most likely to enter the East Palace, was now banished to Shuzhou to herd sheep. The officials of the king of Shu's faction avoided him as if he was the plague. How could they provoke him at such a critical moment? Could it be that royal consort Chui was really out of her mind? Everyone could clearly see the current situation in the imperial court. The college was about to open, and Countess Li was highly valued by His Majesty. He was in high spirits and no one in the imperial court could steal his edge. The king of Shu's faction had just suffered a heavy blow. Now it was best to keep a low profile and wait for the right time. It was really stupid to provoke the other party at such a critical moment. Chapter 594. The lights in Hibiscus Garden were still the same, and the lake was full of lanterns. As the breeze blew, the water sparkled and crushed the shadows of the lanterns in the lake. What happened in Yingzue Garden was just a small interlude. Less than an hour later, people came out of the hall one after another. The officials and nobles found their families, either strolling in the garden at night or accompanying them home. As they walked along the corridor on the water, the Shitsi Fei said to Rui, "Lu Jiejie, if you run into my husband later, please tell him that I will stay behind to accompany the empress tonight. He can go back by himself." Rui nodded. The crown princess smiled and turned to walk back into the hall. "He usually stays at home and likes to cook. He likes to make some strange things." Rui and third Miss Chen walked side by side and said something with a smile. "The two of them are very different." Third Miss Chen shook her head and said softly. Rui naturally knew who the two people she was talking about were, but she didn't want to continue this topic. "Hey, isn't this third Miss Chen?" A strange voice suddenly came from the front. Princess Hui, who had just left the hall, suddenly appeared there. She looked a little strange. She looked at third Miss Chen and said, "I heard that Li family's Li Minghan came back some time ago. You didn't wait in vain for the past 20 years. Hearing this, third Miss Chen's body trembled. She clenched her fists in her sleeves and her face turned slightly pale. Many women who passed by on the corridor paused and frowned slightly when they heard this. Third Miss Chen was a sentimental person. Her matter was not a secret in the circle of the nobles in the capital city. Everyone knew that her hair turned white overnight because of Li Minghan. If they talked to her on normal days, they would avoid talking about that topic. What Princess Hui said just now was indeed a little too much. It was impossible that she didn't know that Li Minghan had passed away. At this moment, she said these words on purpose to make third Miss Chen sad. However, Qin family, Chui family and Hui Wang, weren't they always on the same boat? Princess Hui smiled and said, "Oh, I forgot. Li Minghan died a long time ago. It's good that he died. What's the point of living in this world for such a heartless person? But I seem to have heard that Li Minghan's son looks exactly like him. As the saying goes, the son pays his father's debts." "Shut up." A light reprimand suddenly sounded. Princess Hui was slightly startled. When she looked at the woman beside third Miss Chen, the anger that she had suppressed with great difficulty rose again. She said angrily, "How dare you? Who are you?" She had wanted to use her status to pressure her, but when she saw the woman's eyes, she felt her tongue stiffen and she couldn't say what she wanted to say. Apart from that, there seemed to be something pressing down on her, causing her breathing to stagnate. Even opening her mouth became extremely difficult. "Let's go." Rui smiled and turned to speak to third Miss Chen. She took a step forward, but Princess Consort Hui staggered a few steps back and bumped into the railing of the corridor. The maid beside her didn't have time to help her and saw Princess Consort Hui fall down head first. Although it was not the center of the lake, the water was not shallow. Princess Hui flopped a few times on the water and then there was no sound. The maid was so scared that her soul almost left her body. She screamed, "Help! Help! Help! Princess has fallen into the water." Not far away, a group of imperial guards rushed over. When they came to the front, they immediately jumped down without hesitation. Princess Hui was soon rescued, but she fainted because of excessive shock. Seeing this scene, the woman was frightened. Recalling the scene just now, she couldn't come to her senses for a long time. Madame Li clearly didn't do anything. She just took a step forward and Princess Hui stepped back several steps until she fell into the lake. Why did this scene look so familiar? After a while, they remembered that King of Shu was so scared by County Uncle Li's murderous eyes that he jumped into the lake. When they looked at Mrs. Li again, they couldn't help but be frightened. When they walked forward again, the crowd retreated. Third Miss Chen didn't say anything along the way. After walking out of the long corridor on the lake, Li Yi and Li Xian were waiting not far away. You go first. I'll wait for them. Third Miss Chen said and stood there waiting for the woman of the Chen family. Ru Yi glanced ahead and didn't say anything. After saying goodbye to her, she walked straight ahead. Did concubine Chui do anything to you just now? Li Yi asked Ru Yi in the carriage after leaving Furong Garden. Ru Yi shook her head and said, What could she do to me? She helped Li Yi adjust his collar and said with a smile, My husband, you forgot that I'm very powerful. No, I still can't take this lying down. Although what happened tonight didn't affect Ru Yi much, courtesy demanded reciprocity since ancient times was a traditional virtue. Traditional virtues couldn't be lost. How could one only accept gifts and not give them? I'm fine. My husband, don't act recklessly. Ru Yi looked at him and said in a low voice. Li shook his head and said, As a county uncle, of course, I have to set an example and abide by the law. How can I act recklessly? After a quarter of an hour, the carriage couldn't go any further. Tonight, several main streets in the capital were full of traffic. It was difficult for carriages and horses to move. Li Yi and Ru Yi got out of the carriage. In the sky behind them, fireworks rose and exploded. The first night of the Lantern Festival had passed. According to the situation in previous years, the residual heat of the Lantern Festival would probably last for 2 or 3 days. After the Lantern Festival, the New Year's festival was finally over. For the ordinary people in the capital, life returned to peace and it was time for another busy year. However, for the officials in the imperial court, the word peace had nothing to do with them. No matter when, there were countless undercurrents surging in the imperial court. A little carelessness would cause one to be involved and be doomed eternally. Last night in the hibiscus garden, the wife of County Uncle Li was framed by the personal maid of concubine Chui. This was one of the undercurrents, which was regarded by everyone as some kind of action of concubine Chui. After all, everyone knew that County Uncle Li and the King of Shu were completely on the opposite side. The more he was valued by the emperor, the worse it was for the King of Shu. In front of so many people, Princess Hui was surprised by Third Miss Chen's sarcastic remarks, which made many people puzzled. The Chen family was the closest ally of the King of Shu and was also on the same path as Prince Hui. If the two families hadn't fallen out, how could Princess Hui say such words in public? They didn't know when it started, but they gradually began to understand these things. But there was one thing that everyone was very clear about. That was, the faction of the King of Shu, which was once powerful enough to control the imperial court, seemed to be gradually declining. Early in the morning at the gate of the Chen family, a young man came forward and handed over an invitation saying, Please send a message that Prince Duanyang is here to visit old Marquis Chen. The gatekeeper of the Chen family looked at the young man a few more times and thought, Why did Prince Duanyang come at this moment? The second master is angry and probably won't be nice to him. However, Prince Duanyang was different from others. No matter what, he had to bring him in first. The servant of the Chen family invited Prince Duanyang in, and a middle-aged man came out. Who is this? Chen Chang's expression was somewhat ugly as he asked coldly. The servant hurriedly said, Second master, this is Prince Duanyang. His mother was reprimanded by concubine Chui last night and ordered him to come to the Chen family's mansion early this morning to admit his mistake. Knowing that the person in front of him was the second master of the Chen family, Prince Duanyang immediately cupped his hands and said, I am Li Da. Before he could finish his words, he felt a sharp pain in his chest and was kicked out of the door. Prince Duanyang covered his chest with his face twisted in pain. He raised his head and looked at the middle-aged man in front of him with a look of disbelief. Get lost. Chen Chang's face was gloomy and his eyes flashed with killing intent. He spat out a word coldly. Chapter 595. In the hibiscus garden on the night of the Upper Lantern Festival, Consort Hui reopened the scar in Third Miss Chen's heart in front of many people. The next day, Second Master Chen broke 2 of Prince Duanyang's ribs with a kick. The 2 most reliable allies of the King of Shu turned against each other. Countless people sighed in their hearts. They were getting more and more confused by the world. The Chen and Chui families were almost on the same side. Prince Hui and Chui were also on the same side. In this way, the Chen and Prince Hui could only wear the same pair of pants. The relationship between the 2 families was known by all the officials and nobles in the capital city. But why did the 2 families stab each other in the back recently? No one knew what happened to Prince Duanyang after his 2 ribs were broken. It was Consort Shui who would have a headache because of this. Consort Shui must have had a lot of headaches these days. Li Yi had not left his house for 2 days. The academy was about to open and the old emperor placed great importance on it. No matter what, he had to pretend that he was seriously preparing for it and that he would not hesitate to risk his life for the good of the country. Moreover, he didn't go out for 2 days because he was doing something more important. But now he was leaning against the door and watching the show. Fang was driven out of the house by his wife with a broom. His wife put her hands on her waist and scolded him for being a wastrel. The cause of this incident was when old Fang went to fight for the hero ranking. In the end, he could not control his strength and ended up seriously injuring the elite ranked on the heaven ranking list whom he challenged. He had to pay dozens of taels of silver for his medical expenses, and old Fang's wife was worried about the money. Hence this scene happened. Wastrel, don't come back to sleep tonight. His wife scolded angrily and went home. Fang walked over dejectedly and squatted down beside Li Yi with a depressed face. Li Yi looked down at him and said, "Don't pretend. Don't go back to sleep tonight. You want it to be like this, don't you?" Lao Fang raised his head and said righteously, "Young master, what you said is wrong. When have I ever slept in the jadeite courtyard at night? Here comes work." Li Yi glanced at him and walked into the mansion. "There's a job?" Fang stood up abruptly with an excited look on his face. He immediately chased after the man. Less than an hour later, he walked out with half a green cucumber in his hand. He took a bite of it and muttered to himself in a low voice, "What are you doing with these things? Burning bricks? I don't think there are any plans to build any houses." He looked up and saw his wife standing at the door. She looked at him coldly and said, "What are you waiting for? Come back." "I'm coming." Fang sighed and a disappointed expression appeared on his face. He shook his head, put the booklet in his bosom and walked back with his head lowered. Back then, the Math Academy had enrolled a total of 100 students. Now, the total number of students was about 120. Getting in through the back door was common everywhere. Since the old emperor couldn't reject them, Li couldn't just shut them out. There were still a few people who were forced into the academy like the little bastard. Fortunately, there were not many of them and it was within the range that Li could accept. Otherwise, if someone voluntarily dropped out, it would be hard for him to explain to the old emperor. The class schedule of the Math Academy was very scientific. There were 5 days in class and 2 days off, and 1 month in the winter and summer vacations. Classes were held from 8 a.m. to 12 p.m., and from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. There were also breaks between classes. There were no self-study sessions at night. It was very humane. Learning mathematics for 8 hours a day was actually very painful. However, it was a piece of cake for the students who could read the 4 books and 5 classics for a lifetime. This kind of high-intensity knowledge instilling could cultivate a batch of useful mathematics talents for the Jing Kingdom in a short period of time. Whether it was the schedule, the content of the classes, or even the timetable, they were all very scientific. The doctoral students from the Math Academy agreed with this. The Math Academy had been separated from the Math Academy. Currently, the doctoral students from the Math Academy were temporarily under Li Yi's command. They were the first to come into contact with the new mathematics, so their starting point was much higher than the students from the Math Academy. As teaching assistants, they would listen to the lectures and assist the doctoral students in teaching. A doctoral student from the Math Academy held the timetable in his hand. He looked up at Li Yi and asked curiously, "Sir Dean, aren't you going to teach the students?" There was something wrong with the timetable in his hand. Why wasn't the most important dean's name on it? Li Yi glanced at him and said, "The dean's responsibility is to provide strategic support for the mathematics school in the general direction and to oversee the overall situation. If he has to do something as trivial as teaching, then what's the point of having teachers like you?" Another doctoral student next to him glared at the fellow who had just spoken and said with a smile, "Sir Dean, you're right. We'll definitely remember your teachings in the future and live up to His Majesty's expectations. We'll cultivate top-notch mathematics talents for the Jing Kingdom." In the end, there were still subordinates who could understand his good intentions. Li nodded and said, "His Majesty isn't here yet. I'll go in and take a nap. Wake me up when His Majesty arrives." The old emperor attached great importance to the Math Academy because it could save him a lot of money. Therefore, on the 2nd day of the 2nd month, which was the opening day of the academy, even though he was ill, he would still bring a few important officials from the imperial court to cut the ribbon and preside over the opening ceremony. At the same time, he would encourage the students so that they would establish a correct outlook on life and study for the rise of the Jing Kingdom. As the dean of the math academy, he naturally had a special place. For example, he could have a huge office all by himself. The bed was also very big so he could sleep, or use it to oversee the overall situation. It was perfect for providing strategic support for the math academy. The old emperor came very quickly. Li Yi was woken up not long after he slept. This time, the lineup of leaders for the inspection was very powerful. Prime Minister Qin did not come, but Prime Minister Shen followed the old emperor. The leaders of the 6 ministries came in person, which gave the math academy a lot of face. In the sports field behind the academy, Jing Di stood on the rostrum and waved to the students below. He said, "You are all the future pillars of the Jing kingdom. You may rise." There were many people on the rostrum including Li Yi. However, when the old emperor was standing, no one dared to sit down. After he finished speaking, Prime Minister Shen went up to speak again. Minister Xuanhuan, the Minister of Revenue, rambled on for another half an hour. Li Yi hated this kind of superficial work the most. However, this was the system. He could not do anything about it. He listened until he was drowsy. Naturally, the students of the Math Academy were not drowsy. On the contrary, they could not suppress the excitement in their hearts when they were able to see the emperor and many important officials in the court. Not only that, His Majesty also promised that as long as they could successfully graduate from the Math Academy, they would immediately be able to get a position. What was the purpose of studying hard for more than 10 years? Wasn't it to one day win an official position and bring glory to their family? Taking bribes, bending the law, committing crimes, to repay His Majesty's appreciation of them. The children of the officials did not have much of an opinion about this. After all, they came here to gild their gold. With this qualification, they would be able to rise rapidly in the future and have a carefree future. For the children of poor families, this was the greatest preferential treatment that the emperor had given them. In the crowd below, a 15 or 16-year-old boy secretly raised his head. When he saw a young man on the stage, his face suddenly showed a bitter expression. Chapter 596. Wang Dan, what's wrong? A boy of the same age beside him noticed his abnormality and asked with some doubts. No, nothing. Wang Dan shook his head and said silently in his heart, can't see me, can't see me. A trace of doubt appeared on the face of the boy beside him. When he looked at the stage again, the doubt turned into impatience. He had been talking for more than an hour. This Minister of Revenue was talking too much nonsense. The Minister of Revenue, Xuanhuan, was a man of few words. Why was he so talkative at this moment? Li didn't know how long he had been listening to Xuanhuan. Just as he was about to fall asleep standing up, a doctor beside him nudged him. County Uncle Li, His Majesty is calling you. Li raised his head and rubbed his eyes. He heard Emperor Jing's voice. He turned his head and Emperor Jing was looking at him. As the Dean of the School of Mathematics, what else do you have to say to the students of the School of Mathematics? Watching the young dean walk to the front, more than half of the people immediately showed deep gratitude on their faces. It was the dean's credit that the students from poor families could have such an opportunity. For the sake of the students from poor families, he did not hesitate to offend the nobles in the capital. He just wanted to fight for more places for the students from poor families. In the imperial court, who was willing to do this for the students from poor families? Of course, a few people in the crowd did not look good. For example, Qin Mao, and Shui Mao looked slightly gloomy. The humiliation on that day had almost made them a joke in the capital. It was not something that could be forgotten in a few months. Li looked down and stretched out his hand to press down. The noise below immediately disappeared. Is everyone here? He turned around and asked one of the mathematics professors. The doctor of mathematics immediately said, in reply to the dean, the 120 students of the School of Mathematics are all here. Since everyone is here, let's take the exam. Li Yi looked at the students below and said, after an hour, gather in the classroom for the entrance exam of the School of Mathematics. Those who do not pass the exam will be disqualified. As the dean, he had nothing to give them, so he would take the exam as a greeting gift. He had thought that the young dean would give a long speech like the others before him, but he had never expected that he would only say 2 short sentences. Before the students could rejoice in their hearts, it immediately turned into astonishment and shock. Those who don't pass the entrance exam will be disqualified? It wasn't easy for him to get into the Arithmetic Academy and enjoy the country's special allowance. After graduation, he was given the treatment of a civil servant. If he were to be expelled from the Arithmetic Academy, losing face would be a small matter. But his dream of becoming an official would be shattered. After a short moment of silence, a huge uproar came from below. Jing Di looked at Li Yi with a puzzled expression, obviously waiting for his explanation. Your Majesty, you don't know. Li Yi walked over, looked at Jing Di and said, as early as 3 months ago, the School of Mathematics has already distributed the textbooks they will use for admission. If they are diligent, 3 months is enough to read all the contents of the textbooks. The content involved in this exam can all be found in the textbooks. If in this case there are still people who do not reach the passing line, it means that they are just lazy people who are destined to not have great achievements. Even if they really enter the court in the future, it will not be a blessing for the court. Li Yi said righteously, the School of Mathematics is indebted to your Majesty, so we have to be responsible to your Majesty and the court. If there are not enough students, we can recruit more, but we must not waste time on these people. Jing Di pondered for a moment and nodded slightly. What you said is reasonable. In this case, I will stay here for a while and see what will happen. Your Majesty, you want to stay here? Li Yi was stunned. Jing Di looked at him and asked, why? Is there a problem? If the old emperor wanted to stay here, he could not take special care of those difficult candidates. Plan A was temporarily cancelled, and the implementation of Plan B was postponed. No. Li Yi shook his head and sighed in his heart. You are so busy with official business, but you still want to waste time here. Don't you know how many memorials you have to read today? The candidates below had already realized that this exam could not be avoided, so they hurriedly walked in the direction of the school's dormitory. There was still an hour before the exam began. They would remember as much as they could. Father. After the students dispersed, Monarch Jin came from the side and walked in front of Jing Di. He looked up and said. Jing Di smiled and touched his head. He said, have you thought about it? Do you really want to be a teacher in this school of mathematics? I have thought about it. Monarch Jin nodded and said, I have grown up. I want to share the burden of father. Jing Di smiled and his face showed a deep sense of relief. The playful boy had finally grown up. He thought of the street with all kinds of delicious food and strange things next to the School of Mathematics. From now on, he did not need to stay in the palace every day. He could go fishing by the river and chase rabbits in the mountains. Li Han's expression became more determined. Father, rest assured. I will be a dutiful teacher. 120 students were divided into 4 exam rooms. Each exam room was supervised by 2 doctors. There were also palace guards at the door and outside the window. Their eyes were like knives and they patrolled the exam room to prevent anyone from cheating. In the exam room, some people were smiling and high-spirited, while others were sad and dejected. Outside the exam room, Li Yi was showing Jing Di and the others around the School of Mathematics. This place was different from the ordinary academies in the Jing Kingdom. The classrooms, playground, dormitory and canteen were all designed by Li Yi himself. The layout was very aesthetic. The green plants on both sides of the road were sprouting, and it was very comfortable to step on the lawn in the middle of the playground. Not bad. Jing Di seemed to have a good impression of this place and he nodded with satisfaction. In fact, it is still not enough. Li Yi regretfully pointed to the open space not far behind and said, if we can dig an artificial lake in that place, it would be better. The students can walk by the lake, read and sleep by the lake. It is also comfortable. But the funds are not enough. We still need tens of thousands of taels of silver. Can your Majesty, ahem? Jing Di coughed and said, there is no need for an artificial lake. This year the national treasury is tight and we need to save unnecessary expenses. Why was it unnecessary? In the summer evening, if the rocking chair was moved to the lake under the tree, the breeze would blow from the lake, and the cicadas would sing. If one was in the mood, they could fish and have a barbecue at night. What a beautiful picture it would be. They could not only think of letting the School of Mathematics export talents for the country. The necessary humanistic care was also indispensable. The old emperor was too poor now. They had to find a way for him to earn some money. When the national treasury was a little full, he would be embarrassed to not pay for the School of Mathematics to dig the lake. Ding! The ringing of the bell meant that the exam was over. All the students walked out of the exam room. Some looked up at the sky and some looked down at the ground. They did not expect to encounter such a thing on the first day of school. They were really not mentally prepared. For some of them, today was the day they entered the school, and also the day they were kicked out of the School of Mathematics. It was a half-day tour of the school, and they could also pay homage to the emperor and the ministers in the court. It seemed that it was not a loss. Chapter 597. All the test papers were copied and printed a few days ago. Originally, they planned to set aside half a day to mark the papers and wait until tomorrow morning to post the results. However, today the old emperor was in a good mood and the results would be marked and summarized immediately. Including Li Yi, the Imperial College's mathematics doctors, mathematics students, and even Prince Jin's little fatty personally marked the papers. It only took a while for all 120 papers to be read. How is it? Emperor Jing came over and looked at Li Yi and asked. Li Yi held a list in his hand and said, out of the 120 students, 21 are unqualified. Emperor Jing took the list and glanced at it. He frowned and said, all of them are from aristocratic families? Yes. Li Yi nodded and said, in today's exam, there were many students from poor families who got full marks. There was no one who failed. Emperor Jing had been deliberately supporting the children of poor families over the years. He knew that they often worked harder than the children of aristocratic families because of their family circumstances. Although they lacked resources, they frequently performed well in the imperial examinations with their hard work. On the other hand, among the children of the aristocratic families, extravagant and lascivious were prevalent. There were many vermin and they were useless. However, the last time the Calculation Academy enrolled students, it was already biased towards the poor. If these 20 people were expelled, there would be many objections in the court. Moreover, among these people, there was the boy from the Wang family and the nephew of concubine Yan. He had promised them not long ago. If he expelled them on the first day of school, he, as the emperor, would lose face. However, in front of so many people, he had already agreed to Li Yi's request. The emperor had to keep his word, so he couldn't take it back at this moment. Everyone makes mistakes. Your Majesty, in my opinion, why don't you give them another chance and let them study in the arithmetic college for 3 months? If they are still so lazy after 3 months, they will be kicked out and will never be hired again. Li Yi thought for a moment and looked at Emperor Jing. During the Spring Festival, he visited many of the Li family's relatives. Among the 21 people, he had met several of them. If he was so heartless, it would be hard for him to meet them in the future. As for the little bastard of the Wang family, the business between the two families had just started, so it was not good for him to disrespect the Wang family. In addition, the boy surnamed Zheng seemed to have some relationship with concubine Yan. He was a proud girl, so it was not good for him to disrespect the Wang family. Of course, he couldn't purposely keep this bunch of disappointing fellows, or else he wouldn't be able to convince the masses. All students should be treated equally. After all, impartiality, fairness and impartiality were his principles in doing things. It's good to know your mistakes and correct them. Emperor Jing looked at Li Yi with satisfaction, nodded and said, that's good. Give them a chance, lest they say that the college is not tolerant. But, Your Majesty, look, Qin Zhong and Chen Hao. Li Yi pointed at the names of the two people and said, they scored 100 points on the test paper, but they didn't even score 10 points. It's too unreasonable. Qin Zhong, the eldest son of the Qin family's third branch, and Chen Hao, a son of the Chen family's side branch. Emperor Jing glanced at them and said faintly, rotten wood cannot be carved. These two people should be expelled directly. Li Yi counted with his fingers. 13 minus 2, there were still more than a dozen? There was still more to come. There was no hurry, there was still a long way to go. However, he could only stop here for today. After all, he had to be fair and just. The results of the entrance examination were posted on a high wall in the arithmetic college. According to a doctor, this wall would be specially used to post examination results. Congratulations, Brother Wang, for getting full marks. Brother He, don't make fun of me. Aren't you the same? Sigh, it's a pity. Just 1 point. I clearly saw that question yesterday. The students gathered under the wall chatted and laughed. At this time, the results had been posted, and it was clear at a glance whether they passed or not. Most people breathed a sigh of relief, and because of the score they began to compete with their friends. Of course, this wall was an honor roll for some people, but for others, it was a pillar of shame. Wang Dan stood in the corner and his face was red. He was so embarrassed that he wished there was a hole on the ground to hide in. These few months he only cared about playing and flipped a few pages of books at the beginning. 60 points was considered a pass, but he didn't even get half of it. He was afraid that he would be expelled today. He couldn't imagine what kind of reprimand and ridicule he would receive when he returned home. A 15 or 16-year-old youth beside him patted his shoulder and said, don't worry, my score is worse than yours. At most, I will be expelled. Who wants to stay in this crappy place? After we leave, we can do whatever we want. No one will care. Wang Dan nodded. If he was expelled, then so be it. At most, he would receive a small punishment and ridicule. In comparison, staying in the arithmetic college and having to face the person he had offended every day was even more terrifying. He even dared to beat up Brother Qin and the King of Shu, let alone himself. For the sake of his life, he had to stay far away from the arithmetic college. At this time, a doctor from the arithmetic college walked over and said, "Anyone who scored more than 60 points in the entrance examination will be considered a pass. Those who pass can leave." Instantly, most of the people started to disperse, but they didn't go too far. They just watched from afar. Those who stayed were naturally those who didn't reach the passing mark. No matter how thick-skinned the 21 of them were, they couldn't hide the shame in their hearts when they were being watched by more than 100 people. These people didn't just include their friends but also the friends of their elders, the current court officials, the ministers of the 6 ministries, the prime minister, the emperor. Li walked over from afar. These people all had their heads lowered, their faces full of shame. "I have good news for all of you." His gaze swept across the crowd and said, "Those who didn't reach the passing mark in the entrance examination originally didn't have the right to enter. However, His Majesty is benevolent and has decided to give all of you another chance. You can enter the college first. 3 months later, the college will conduct another examination for all of you. If you still don't pass by then, you can pack your things and leave." After hearing this, after a brief moment of shock, everyone was immediately overjoyed. They felt as though they had regained what they had lost. They were already prepared to be reprimanded by their elders when they returned, but they didn't expect to get another chance. 3 months was enough. 3 months was enough. After 3 months, they couldn't let such an embarrassing scene happen again. Among the crowd, the youth named Wang Dan heaved a sigh of relief. Although he didn't want to study mathematics here, he couldn't afford to be chased out on the first day. It's good to know your mistakes and correct them. I hope that you can remember today's lesson and study hard in the future to serve the country. You should know that failure isn't scary." Li looked at them and said in a low voice. A look of shame appeared on the faces of the students, but it was soon followed by a look of gratitude. It turned out that the dean didn't want to chase them away. He wanted to use this opportunity to let them learn a lesson and let them understand that failure wasn't scary. Without failure, how could there be success? Jing Di nodded slightly, and the officials behind him also smiled. This young Dean Li did have some ability when it came to admonishing students. "Failure isn't scary," Li said in a low voice. The next moment, his voice suddenly became stern. "What's scary is that you still believe this sentence. 3 months ago, the textbooks were already given to all of you. Even if you took an hour out every day, you would still be able to finish reading the contents of the books. You shouldn't have gotten such a score today. In the face of such a score, don't you feel ashamed?" Li casually pointed at them and said loudly, "All those who didn't pass the examination today frog jumped 10 times around the field." The 21 students stood rooted to the ground, their expressions indescribable. Jing Di, who was still nodding, felt his neck stiffen. The smiles on the faces of the officials behind him froze at this moment. Chapter 598. Looking at the dumbfounded crowd, Prince Jean curled his lips and said, "What are you waiting for? Do 10 frog jumps around the playground, not one less. If you can't complete it, pack up your things and go back." Your Highness, what is frog jumping?" One of them finally reacted and asked with a trembling voice. Li Han put his hands behind his back, squatted on the ground and jumped twice. He stood up and said, "Do you see? Just like this, jump 10 laps. This is your punishment." He pointed at a few Imperial guards and said, "You guys come here and supervise them." Failure was really terrible. Although it was very shameful to do such strange movements in public, they weren't the only ones who were shameful. Compared to being expelled from the academy, this was nothing. Under the supervision of the Imperial guards, the 21 children of the aristocratic families squatted down one by one and started frog jumping around the playground with a sad face. Li Han curled his lips. 1 lap around the playground was more than 100 meters. After they jumped 1 lap, they couldn't even make this kind of expression on their faces. And the most painful thing was not today but tomorrow when they woke up. Thinking about that feeling, his legs were still weak. However, the feeling of punishing others to do frog jumps was really not bad. Haha, what are they doing? A few days ago, I urged Brother Su to read more books, but he refused in every possible way. Brother Su, if it weren't for me, you would be the one squatting there jumping around. How does Brother Su intend to thank me? Tonight, I will invite Brother Zhang for a drink at the Jade Courtyard. Please do me the honor." The students who passed the exam naturally didn't have to be so shameful. They pointed at the people who were doing strange movements and chatted with a smile. Prince Jean looked at Li. Seeing him nod, he walked over with his hands behind his back. Everyone saluted him. Not to mention that he was a prince, just his identity as a teacher of the academy made them automatically ignore his age. Don't be too complacent. Li Han glanced at Li Yi once more before turning back, summoning up his courage to say, in order for you all to adapt in advance, the Academy will arrange some missions for you all. When the time comes, you all might be scattered across the various departments of the Imperial Court, and those who complete the missions will receive corresponding points. There will be a test every half a year, and those who fail will still not be able to successfully graduate from the Academy. The students already understood what the word graduation meant. Not being able to graduate from the School of Mathematics meant that the Imperial Court did not recognize one's status as a student of the School of Mathematics. Not only would one not be able to become an official, but they would also be wasting their time. No one wanted to end up like this. Being able to successfully pass 2 examinations meant that they had some confidence in their own strength. If they could really enter the royal court and do some work, it would be a process of accumulating experience for them. There would be no harm in doing so. Minister of Revenue Xuanhuan stood beside Li Yi and asked, Li Daren, what does His Highness Prince Jin mean? What I mean is, if you encounter any mathematical problems that you can't solve in the future, you can come to the school to borrow people. Li Yi looked at him and said, just don't forget to pay them. Emperor Jing glanced at him and said, you are now an important minister of the Imperial Court. Don't always stink of money. The students of the Academy will still have to work for the Imperial Court in the future. This way they can improve their resumes. There are many benefits. Why talk about rewards? Thank you for your teachings, Your Majesty. The students of the Academy should take the initiative to help the Imperial Court. Money is just a worldly possession. Li looked like he had learned something. He looked at Emperor Jing and said, I want to ask Your Majesty for some worldly possessions. I want to dig an artificial lake in the Academy to build a more comfortable place for the students to study. I wonder. Emperor Jing's expression froze. He suddenly pointed to the field and said, what happened to them? Everyone looked in the direction he pointed and saw that the students who were jumping happily just now were now paralyzed on the ground. It was not until the Imperial Guards forced them to move forward a little bit. Li Han came over and explained, Father, you don't know this. This action looks simple, but it is very painful to persist for a long time. Emperor Jing nodded and said, in the end they will have to enter the Imperial Court to become an official. For such lazy students, we should punish them and make them change their lazy nature. There was a shortage of mathematics talents in the Jing Kingdom. The Academy could only train about 100 people in the first batch. No one could be easily given up. After admonishing the mathematicians, Jing Di turned around and asked, where were we just now? Speaking of the artificial lake. Li Yi reminded him. This Academy of Mathematics, I will leave it to you. Don't let me down. Emperor Jing covered his chest and said, I am a little tired today. I will return to the palace. Farewell, Your Majesty. The professors immediately bowed. Nearly 100 students of the Academy of Mathematics lined the road to see them off. Today they had actually seen the emperor in the flesh. When they returned, they would brag to others. Li Yi's face was full of pity. The stingy old emperor. So many students had done their best for the future of the Jing Kingdom, but he could not even satisfy this small request. It was really disappointing. The Academy of Mathematics was very close to the palace. After Emperor Jing walked out of the gate of the Academy of Mathematics, he put his hand down from his chest. His brows relaxed and he said, the money of the people and nobles in the capital has been earned by them. Now they have come to ask me for money. The national treasury does not have extra money for them to dig a lake. The Minister of Revenue looked at Emperor Jing and with great difficulty closed his astonished mouth. He opened his mouth again and said, yes, the national treasury is tight. It can't withstand any more torment. Return to the palace? Thinking of this, Emperor Jing felt a little annoyed. He waved his hand and stepped onto the dragon carriage. How many laps has it been? Wang Dan turned his head with difficulty and looked around. Seeing that there were figures crawling with difficulty in front and behind him, he asked weakly. It was only the beginning of February and it was chilly in spring. His clothes were all soaked in sweat, and his legs were heavy as if they were tied to 2 mountains. Even taking a step forward was very difficult. There are still 5 laps, an imperial guard behind him said expressionlessly. Thump. Hearing that there were still 5 laps to climb, a sliver of despair rose to Wang Dan's face. The last bit of strength in his body also disappeared. His vision darkened and he fell to the ground. A few steps behind him, the youth surnamed Zheng saw Wang Dan fall and also stopped crawling. His entire body lay on the ground and did not move anymore. Take them to the dormitory. Li Yi waved his hand. It was already difficult for them to run 10 laps around the 400-meter track, let alone frog jump. Even the palace guards did not have the ability to do this. Rolling and crawling to last 5 laps was already beyond his expectations. In the academy there were almost no problems for poor students. No one would not cherish this kind of opportunity to reach the sky in one step. Some of the sons of officials and aristocratic families still needed more training. This was a show of strength. He believed that after today, it would be much easier to lead the troops under him. The bodies of the scholars were thin and weak. In the end, no one could last 10 laps before they were carried away by the imperial guards one by one. If I had known earlier, I would have read more books. Otherwise, I wouldn't have gotten such a low score. Yeah, fortunately. Fortunately, he was just scaring us. The two young men looked at each other and could see the joy in each other's eyes. Although they had passed the previous exam, they thought that it was safe to enter the Academy of Mathematics. After they returned, they did not even look at the so-called new mathematics textbook. Today's exam paper was like a book from heaven. They scored 1 or even 2 digits lower than the others. It could be said that they stood out from the crowd and earned everyone's attention. A figure walked over from afar. The two of them looked at him and hurriedly got up. "Greetings, Your Highness, Prince Jin." Li Han looked at them and asked, "You are Qin Zhong and Xuanhuan?" Chapter 599. The Imperial College was the highest educational institution in the Jing Kingdom. The students there were all elites from all over the country, and they were very serious about learning. Today was the first official day of classes. However, the professors from the Imperial College were surprised to find that the students of the Imperial College were very serious and hardworking. They could tell from their attitude in class that they were even better than the students from the Imperial College. Part of the reason was that the academy did not give face to Prime Minister Qin and Minister Chen, making the two children of officials pack up and go home on the first day. The uniform screams when they went down the stairs should also be one of the reasons. But the most important reason should be that the students restrained themselves, treated learning seriously and diligently. Ding! The bell rang, signaling the end of the morning class. "Alright, that's all for the morning class. Remember to clean the blackboard." A teacher put down the chalk and walked out of the classroom. Although he had practiced it countless times, he still wasn't used to using the chalk in his hands. However, it had to be said that the chalk, made by County Uncle Lee, was indeed convenient to use, even though there was no order to it. He flicked the chalk dust off his fingers and washed his hands with water outside before walking unhurriedly in the direction of the dining hall. He had already thought of the main course for lunch. It would be braised beef noodles with 2 extra eggs. It was free for lunch, which was the subsidy given by the imperial court to the teachers of the Imperial College. It was illegal to slaughter cattle without permission, so beef couldn't be eaten often. Thus he decided to eat 2 bowls of noodles with 4 eggs today. "Zhengyin, you help me clean the blackboard," Wang Dan said weakly as she lay on the table in the classroom. "I don't have the strength." As soon as he finished speaking, another feeble voice came from beside him. Wang Dan covered her stomach that had been growling for a long time and said, "When are we going to eat?" Zheng Yin shook his head and said, "There are 10 steps to the dining hall. I'm not going." Wang Dan lived on the 2nd floor of the dormitory. When she thought of the feeling when she went down the stairs this morning, her expression immediately became a little frightened. "Then I'm not eating either." 2 students carried large bowls into the classroom and found their seats. They ate and read books at the same time. For students from poor families, educational resources were scarce. Sometimes just to borrow a book they would have to travel dozens of miles. Whether it was eating or going to the toilet, they would not let go of any time that they could read. The braised beef noodles were very fragrant. The 2 students were watching 30 years of scientific examination, 50 years of simulation, while slurping the noodles. The fragrance instantly filled the entire classroom. Gulp. Wang Dan started to drool uncontrollably. "Beast?" Zheng Yin's throat quivered as he cursed in his heart. The 2 of them looked at each other with anger on their faces. The classroom was a place for learning. Did they think it was a cafeteria? The 2 brothers in front. In the end, Wang Dan couldn't help but speak first. After calling them twice, the 2 people in front came back to their senses and asked doubtfully, "What can I do for you two?" Wang Dan squeezed out a smile and said, "Can the 2 of you help us buy lunch from the dining hall?" The faces of the 2 commoners were filled with difficulty. This round trip would take up at least 2 questions time, Pa. Wang Dan placed a silver ingot on the table and said, "Help us buy some food and this silver ingot is yours." Delicious. In front of Wang Dan was a bowl the size of a human head. At this moment he was slurping on the noodles. Although he wasn't the legitimate son of the Wang family, it was precisely because he wasn't the eldest son that he didn't have to bear much responsibility. He had been pampered since he was young, but right now, he almost cried when he saw this bowl of braised beef noodles. Beside him, Zheng wasn't much better. He had been starving since yesterday. Not to mention a bowl of beef noodles. Even if there was a cow in front of him, he naturally wouldn't be able to eat it. The two of them raised their heads and looked at each other. Instantly, they had the feeling of brothers going through thick and thin together. It was better to go through thick and thin together than to share riches. After yesterday's incident, the already close relationship between the two of them was once again pulled closer. Good brother. Wang Dan took a piece of beef from his bowl and passed it to him. His arms stiffened in midair. He raised his head and asked, "Why is there so much more beef in your bowl than mine?" "Hello, Dean." In the courtyard, the young man bowed respectfully to Li Yi, his face full of awe. Wang Yong patted his brother's shoulder and said to Li Yi with a smile, "This child has been mischievous since he was young. He has caused trouble for Dean Li." "It's no trouble at all. This child is very obedient." Li Yi smiled and patted his brother's head. Wang Yong pointed in a certain direction and said to Wang Dan, "Go over there and wait for a while. I have something to say to Dean Li." The young man nodded obediently. After taking a few steps, he heard laughter coming from a room beside him. When he turned his head to look, his eyes couldn't help but widen. In the room, although young, His Highness Prince Jean, who was very knowledgeable and liked to teach students all day long, was riding on a monster, and shaking it with all his might. On his face was a smile that he had never seen before. "Ha, faster, faster." Li Han was riding on Pleasant Goat. The guard at the side pushed a thick pole up and down, causing the cart to shake. Li Han laughed loudly. In the next moment he seemed to realize something. He suddenly raised his head and looked outside the door. When he saw a pair of shocked eyes, the smile on his face froze. "Stop." He got off the cart, straightened his clothes and walked to the door. With a calm expression he said, "Wang Dan, why are you here?" It's over. Seeing Mr. Jin's expression, Wang Dan's heart gradually sank. He accidentally saw this side of Mr. Jin. How was he going to live in the academy in the future? In an instant, he felt like he had just escaped from the tiger's mouth and entered the wolf's den. I wonder how big the big business that Brother Li is talking about is? Wang Yong put down his teacup and looked at Li Yi with a smile. It's even bigger than the perfume and liquor business. Li Yi looked at him and said, "I just don't know if the Wang family can handle it." Wang Yong was stunned for a moment. Then, the smile on his face became even brighter. "Brother Li, don't worry. In this world, there is no business that the Wang family can't handle." The two of them looked at each other and smiled. Some important matters had been settled with this smile. "Brother Wang, take care." After a while, Li Yi stood at the door and cupped his hands at Wang Yong. "Brother Li, I won't see you out." Wang Yong turned back and smiled. He left with Wang Dan, but the latter's face was a little pale as he left. On the horse, Wang Dan asked his brother in a trembling voice, "Big brother, can I not go to the academy?" "Nonsense." Wang Yong looked at him and said in a low voice, "Father spent so much effort to send you there. How can you let him down like this?" Sigh. Wang Dan sighed as she listened to the nagging. She closed her eyes in despair. In the courtyard, Fang's eyes widened. He held something under the sunlight and looked at it carefully. He asked, "Young master, do you think this broken thing is worth much?" "Broken thing?" Li Yi was also fiddling with something in his hand. After several rounds of continuous improvement, its quality was much better than before. However, since he wanted to perfect it, he could not rush it. For the time being, he decided to experiment for a while longer. If he made some slight improvements, the price would not be as simple as doubling. When he heard old Fang's words, he tossed the item over and asked, "How much do you think this little thing is worth?" "It only costs a few copper coins. How much can it be worth?" "But it's colorful and pretty." Fang looked at it again and looked at Li Yi. He said uncertainly, "2 taels of silver?" Chapter 600. Don't look at me like that again. Li Yi was searching for information in his mind. He looked up and saw that Fang's eyes were as wide as copper bells. He had been staring at him like this for at least a quarter of an hour. Ever since he knew that these pieces of junk could realize his dream of having a beautiful wife, a beautiful concubine, and a big house, he had been staring at him like this. It still doesn't work. Li Yi sighed. The colorless glass had not been baked yet. He had to find a way to remove the metal elements inside. Moreover, there were a lot of bubbles inside which greatly reduced the visual impact. If he took it outside and said that it was a glass that was gifted by the heavens and was worth tens of thousands of gold coins, not many people would believe it. Improvement: the process had to be improved. Moreover, when the time came to do the modeling, he needed skilled craftsmen, and they had to be his own people. He would not feel at ease leaving it to others. Casually throwing away the defective product in his hand, Fong moved like a hungry dog pouncing on its food and finally saved it before it fell to the ground. However, he fell face first into the mud. Getting up from the ground, he did not even have time to pat the dust off his body. He glared at Li Yi and said, "Young master, what are you doing?" He gently stroked the object in his hand. What was this? This was a house, a concubine, and a dream. Moreover, his dream had changed a few days ago. A big house was no longer a problem for him. If he could live in the palace that the young master mentioned and have dozens of people serving him, how comfortable would that be? Li Yi looked at him and said, "This thing is not that valuable now. Wear it into beads, make it into jewelry, and make some beautiful styles. Tell them to work hard and don't be lazy. We don't have so much time to waste. If anyone dares to be lazy, break his dog legs." Fong carefully put away the thing in his hand and strode outside. In fact, he had been the laziest during this period of time. However, at that moment, he suddenly realized that since the son-in-law had entrusted this task to him, he had to do his best. He couldn't be lazy, he couldn't slack, and he couldn't let down the son-in-law's trust and expectations in him. Although he still had some doubts about whether this thing could be sold for such a high price, his son-in-law wouldn't let him do something meaningless. When he walked out of the door, he saw a few naughty children playing on the sand. He kicked the nearest naughty child's butt and scolded, "Go play somewhere else." In early February, the willow tree by the lake of the Faculty of Mathematics had already begun to sprout. The green jade grew to the height of the tree, and thousands of green ribbons hung down. The lake water was clear and fish could be seen swimming occasionally. A gentle breeze blew from the surface of the lake. Sitting on the grassland with a small slope, leaning against the willow tree, Renbachian held a copy of 30 Years of Scientific Examination, 50 Years of Simulation. Such a scene was naturally what Li Yi had imagined. Now there was only a bare grassland. On the other side of the grassland, a few students who didn't finish their homework on time were frog jumping with their hands tied. Further away there was a crowd of people watching. The bell rang, signaling the start of class. The crowd dispersed and walked quickly to the classroom. Li Han's plump body stood at the door of a classroom. The students who passed by him would greet him respectfully, "Good day, sir." He had a book under his arm. When the bell rang for the second time, he slowly stepped into the classroom. Compared to a few days ago, he was more mature and steady now. He never pretended to be polite in front of the students. No one could associate him with the silly guy who was sitting in the rocking car yesterday afternoon. "Stand up." "Good day, sir." A uniform voice immediately came from the classroom. There were many rules in the Faculty of Mathematics. For example, they had to do morning exercises before class in the morning. The second set of National Primary School radio gymnastics was even more shameful than frog jumping. However, it was set by the dean, who didn't show his face often and had absolute authority in the faculty. No one could violate it. Gymnastics or frog jumping. This was a choice without hesitation. More than 100 rough men dancing awkwardly on the field was, of course, an eyesore. Therefore, after seeing it once, Li Yi didn't want to see it again. When the Faculty of Mathematics was recruiting students, he didn't think of getting some female students in. Although it was impossible to let them attend class together, it would be good to see them from afar after class. Otherwise, in a certain kind of upper-class society, Li Yi would really be worried that there would be a scandal in the student dormitory if he didn't see any women all year round. That would also make him lose face as the dean. However, the possibility of this proposal being passed wasn't high. Although the situation of women in the capital city had changed a lot, it wasn't to the extent that adult men and women could study together in the same classroom. On one side of the Faculty of Mathematics was the Jing Kingdom Girls' School that was still under construction. On the other side was the Science Faculty that had already been completed and would soon open. Forget about the Science Faculty, there definitely wouldn't be women. However, the Princess Royal Highness Girls' School was different. When the time came, they could organize some superficial exchanges between the students of the two Faculty of Mathematics. In time, they could change the unhealthy habits in the hearts of some of the Faculty of Mathematics. Inside the classroom, Li Han was writing something on the blackboard. He wasn't tall enough, so Li Yi asked the carpenter to specially make a step for him. This kid was born to do mathematics, especially when there was no need for advanced mathematics. In the past year, he had already mastered elementary mathematics to a certain level. The students of the Faculty of Mathematics were actually much easier to teach and manage than the students of the future. Everyone was an adult, and they were adults with terrifying self-awareness. Those who could pass the admission exam didn't lack a foundation in mathematics. What they lacked was the ability to change and guide their thinking. For them, they were already familiar with Arabic numerals. Now, they were gradually changing their traditional thinking. The few mathematics PhDs taught different subjects. Elementary algebra and elementary geometry were currently the main subjects of study. Li Han didn't teach these. In his words, he didn't want to teach these things that were only for children. He was the only teacher in the entire Faculty of Mathematics who could teach application of mathematics. The course, Application of Mathematics, involved specific problems. For example, how to determine the specific number of chickens and rabbits in cages without any indescribable incidents. For example, how to use shadows to measure the height of the hall of diligent government without climbing to the roof. For example, how long would it take for the soldiers of the Jing Kingdom to catch up with the soldiers of the Qi Kingdom who could travel 80 kilometers in a day during a march to a war? And so on and so on. Where there is a loan, there is a loan. Where there is a loan, there must be an equal loan. Li Han wrote these words on the blackboard, then pointed at someone below and said, "Wang Dan, can you explain to me what I meant by what I said in the last lesson?" A young man stood up helplessly and said, "Sir, if there's a loan, there must be a loan. If there's a loan, there must be a loan. If there's a loan, there must be an equal one. This is the basic rule of the debit and credit bookkeeping method." The specific content is, the young man explained the concept clearly. Li Han nodded in satisfaction and said, "You said it well. Sit down." He turned around and said, "Today we will use a few specific examples to explain what the debit and credit bookkeeping method is all about." Li looked out the window. Li Han had already stepped onto the stairs. He was waving his short arms and writing something on the blackboard. It was hard to imagine that he was only 10 years old. If he continued to develop like this, it wouldn't be long before he could enjoy a peaceful retirement. Hurry up and grow up. Li looked at the figure in the classroom and thought to himself. Chapter 601. As Li Yi flipped through the account books at home, Li Xian stood in front of him with a haggard face. The Academy of Sciences was about to open, but he hadn't even solved the problem of military provisions. It would be strange if he wasn't anxious. "Take it." Li took out a book from the drawer and threw it at him. He had paid the price of a pimple by staying up late to write it. It was all about the ideas of modern military provisions and the specific production methods. As for the problem of sealing, it was also described in detail. Some modern methods couldn't be realized, and the methods that could be adopted were very limited. Fortunately, it wasn't impossible. As long as one found the right direction and overcome one or two technical difficulties, it would be fine. This was not a difficult task for Li Xian, who had a lot of skilled craftsmen under him. Not long after, Li Xian walked out of the room with a relaxed expression. However, he was pulled over by the proud Lolita who was guarding outside the door. She glanced into the room and said in a low voice, "Brother Xian, I want to ask you something. Don't lie to me." "What is it?" Li Xian looked puzzled. The proud Lolita pulled him to the corner and asked, "Sir, were you kidnapped by Sister Rui to get married?" Li Xian looked at her and said, "Why are you asking this? Just tell me." The proud Lolita twisted her body and said. Li Xian nodded and asked again, "Yes, what's wrong?" "It's really a bride kidnapping?" The proud Lolita first widened her eyes. After glancing into the room again, she narrowed her eyes and looked thoughtful. Recently, the atmosphere in the court was a little depressed. The news revealed by the Imperial Physician Bureau showed that His Majesty's health was deteriorating, and the situation was not optimistic. An emperor was terrible, but an emperor who was about to reach the end of his life was even more terrible. This kind of terror was directly reflected in the recent iron-blooded measures taken by the Intelligence Division. Last time, the case of the Assistant Minister of Justice's corruption had involved a total of 100,000 taels of silver. It was a rare case of corruption in recent years. The Assistant Minister of Justice, xuanhuan, was still locked up in the Supreme Court. Over the past few days he had confessed to many people. Even 2 fifth-rank officials were involved. They were all purged by the Secret Intelligence Division. For a time, everyone in the Imperial Court felt insecure. Of course, there were different levels of danger. Among them, the ones who were the most terrified were naturally the King of Shu. The Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Justice, Zhao Guangyuan, had always been in close contact with the King of Shu. Naturally, the friends he befriended were also officials in the King of Shu's faction. Unfortunately, after he was caught for corruption, His Majesty issued an imperial edict that if he confessed to one person, his punishment would be reduced by a bit. It was said that Sir Zhao's punishment had already changed from beheading to 530 years in prison. If he worked harder and confessed to a few more of the country's vermin, he might still have a chance to see the light of day again in his lifetime. As a result, some officials in the King of Shu's faction had their properties confiscated and their properties sent to the national treasury. It was roughly estimated that in a few months, there were at least hundreds of thousands of taels of silver in the national treasury. His Majesty was obviously not satisfied with this. This time he seemed to be determined to investigate the corrupt officials in the capital. This time the imperial censorate was ordered to check the accounts of the yamen and departments to find the corrupt officials one by one. As soon as this order was issued, many officials in the capital panicked. 300,000 taels of silver is still far from enough. Jing Di drank a mouthful of snow pear soup and said with a frown. The Minister of Revenue, Xuanhuan, sighed and said, just like the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Justice, Zhao Guangyuan, who embezzled 100,000 taels of silver but did not dare to spend a penny. This is the only example. The few people he confessed had already squandered all the money they had embezzled. The remaining figures are just the figures obtained after calculating their properties when the Secret Intelligence Unit was ordered to confiscate their properties. Father, the accounts of the inner mansion have been verified. Sitting on the side, Li Han, who had been lowering his head and fiddling with the abacus, suddenly put down the abacus and stretched. So fast? Jing Di asked in surprise. Li Han smiled embarrassedly and fiddled with the abacus. He said, Sir's abacus is easy to use. The accounts of the inner mansion are clear. It doesn't take much effort. Jing Di nodded. The inner mansion was the department that managed the expenses of the palace and the royal family. Under his supervision, it was indeed unlikely that there would be any big mistakes. Previously, when they checked the accounts, the three of them needed at least 5 days to finish checking all the accounts. However, from the time Han started fiddling with the abacus, it had only been less than 4 hours, right? He wanted to ask a few more questions, but a eunuch outside the door reported that Deputy Minister Ma of the Imperial Censor was asking for an audience. The Imperial Censor had just received his order yesterday to check the accounts of all the yamens in the capital. Deputy Minister Ma must have come for this matter. Jing Di waved his hand and said, Enter. Deputy Minister Ma walked in from outside. He first bowed to Jing Di and then said, The Imperial Censor has been ordered by His Majesty to check the accounts of all the yamens in the capital. However, the Imperial Censor's attainments in mathematics are not high. In order to complete His Majesty's task as soon as possible, I would like to ask His Majesty for an edict to borrow a few students from the arithmetic school to assist the Imperial Censor in checking the accounts. A certain headmaster had once said that if the Imperial Court needed the help of the students of the School of Mathematics, they could just speak up. Things like auditing accounts should be left to those who specialized in mathematics. As for the Imperial Censorate, it was enough for them to act as a supervisor. Approved. Jing Di glanced to his side and said, Han, you can choose some students from the arithmetic school to assist the Imperial Censor. Li Han raised his head and said, Father, the students of the arithmetic school have to go out for an internship to help the court and earn credits. It must be signed by the director himself. Hearing this, Jing Di waved his hand at Deputy Minister Ma and said, In that case, you can go find Li yourself. Deputy Minister Ma could only helplessly retreat after hearing this. The reason why he came to see His Majesty first was that he was worried that County Uncle Li would ask for an exorbitant price and ask for a huge reward from them. The Imperial Censor was a well-paid yamen. The Imperial Censors were all poor. How could they have any reward to pay them? He sighed. Since His Majesty said so, he could only try his luck first. Borrow people? After listening to Deputy Minister Ma in front of him, Li nodded and said, How many people do you want? Deputy Minister Ma looked at him and asked tentatively, Director Li, how should we calculate the reward for the students? Li waved his hand and said, They have the opportunity to contribute to the court. That is their duty. There is no need to talk about rewards. Deputy Minister Ma was stunned for a moment. When he looked at Li again, he immediately felt a deep sense of guilt. County Uncle Li was a real gentleman. He had guessed him before. He really gauged the heart of a gentleman with his own mean measure. He shouldn't have. I only need 10 people. Deputy Minister Ma cupped his hands and said, It's not good to leave one. I will round it up and give you 11. Li thought for a moment and said, Leave one? Deputy Minister Ma looked at him doubtfully. It's not important. Li waved his hand and said, "In short, I will give you 11 people." Deputy Minister Ma gave 11 people. Deputy Minister Ma felt even more guilty. He looked ashamed and cupped his hands and said, "Thank you, Director Li. I will definitely put in a good word for Director Li in front of His Majesty." Deputy Minister Ma, "You are too polite." Li smiled and said, "It's what we should do to earn your salary and share your worries." Chapter 602. There was something wrong with Fong the past few days. He always looked a little too excited. Li noticed that his eyes were shining when he looked at the pile of sand at the entrance. Something was wrong with the arrogant Lolita too. Li noticed that her eyes were shining when she looked at him. Fong's illness was incurable. He probably thought that money was floating in the sky. As for the arrogant Lolita, it was hard to guess what a girl was thinking. Li didn't want to guess. At least for now, she hadn't made any further moves. He had to teach Li Han how to use the debit and credit bookkeeping method. After all, this was the first internship for the students of the School of Mathematics. They had to make some achievements so that they wouldn't be looked down upon by the imperial court. Accounting was broad and profound. Tax evasion and falsification were all inseparable from this line of work. If they were to learn these things systematically, the School of Mathematics would have to open a new accounting major. It would take 4 years for undergraduate students and 3 years for postgraduate students to be able to produce a few experts in this field. Although the little fatty was a genius, he had only learned how to use the debit and credit bookkeeping method to check the accounts. However, it was enough for him. He couldn't use the more profound methods at the moment. This world still used the very unscientific accounting method of keeping accounts. Keeping accounts by date made it very troublesome to check the accounts. If one wanted to falsify the accounts and take advantage of loopholes, it couldn't be any easier, and it wouldn't be easy for the higher-ups to find out. Since the old emperor was determined to fight against corruption this time, he would give him a big wave. Using this method to check the accounts, no small fly could hide from the big tiger. While Li was explaining the details to Monarch Jean, the arrogant Lolita was sitting on a small stool not far away. She supported her chin with one hand and blinked her eyes as she watched. After a while, she put down her arms and clenched her fists. She murmured, "If I still don't marry him when I'm 18, I'll snatch him." After lunch, many students of the School of Mathematics gathered under the high wall where the results were posted. They were discussing something in low voices. This time, the wall wasn't posted about the exam rankings. It was about something else. The Imperial Censorate had been ordered by the Emperor to investigate the accounts of the various yamen in the capital. They had borrowed a dozen students from the School of Mathematics and Mathematics. The names of the students who had been lucky enough to be chosen were pasted on the paper. Chen Lisan, Qin Feng, Cui Shixin, Li Jianren, Zheng Zijian. After looking at the names on the list, many people immediately sighed and their expressions were slightly gloomy. It turned out that the principal's words weren't just empty words. The students of the academy could familiarize themselves with the bureaucracy and accumulate experience by going out for an internship. At the same time, they could also establish a foundation in the Ministry of Personnel, which would greatly benefit their future prospects. This time, assisting the Imperial Censorate in auditing the accounts was the first opportunity for an academy student to participate in an internship. Those who were lucky enough to be selected would be able to obtain enough credits after the internship. These credits were very important as they would determine whether or not they could successfully graduate from the Mathematics Academy in the future. If they missed this opportunity, they could only wait for the next one. Qinlisan Qinfeng. Sigh, all of them. Don't tell me that there's no chance for us poor students? Shu, Brother Su, be careful with your words. This is only the first time. We will have more chances in the future. The students from poor families discussed in low voices, and there were inevitably times when they sighed. There was no other reason other than the fact that the 11 people on the list were all from aristocratic families, and none of them were poor students. Compared to those people, the opportunities for poor students were pitifully few. Now that Dean Li was finally willing to do something for the poor students, they didn't expect that even the precious opportunity to go out for an internship would be treated so unfairly. A student from a poor family sighed and said, "The principal has already done enough for us. Not only did he let us study here, he even applied for a living allowance from the imperial court. For this, he has already offended too many powerful officials. We cannot make things difficult for him anymore. Yes, we are indebted to little Dean Li. We are poor students, so we definitely cannot do anything to make things difficult for him. Isn't that ungrateful?" Another student from a poor family said righteously. "This matter ends here, no further discussion is allowed. If you have the energy, go back and do a few more sets of simulation scrolls. A sound of agreement came from the crowd, and they quickly dispersed, returning to their respective classrooms. On the other side, under a willow tree, several figures gathered together, and their expressions were not very good. After a moment of silence, someone was finally the first to speak. That surnamed Li would definitely not give such a good thing to us, and it just had to be the 11 of us, not one more, not one less. There must be a trick in this. Qin Lisan raised his head and said coldly, "That's right." Qin Feng nodded and then said, "Qin Zhong and Qin Hao have already been eliminated by him. We have become a thorn in his side, a thorn in his flesh. This must be another plot of his." Cui Shixin was the calmest and most composed of them all. After thinking for a moment, he opened his mouth and said, "But, this matter of checking the accounts was ordered by His Majesty to supervise the Imperial Censorate. That surnamed Li has no right to interfere. We are only accompanying the Imperial Censorate to check the accounts. I really can't think of any conspiracy he could have." Shixin is right, I also can't think of any conspiracy in this. Another young man said, "Moreover, this is indeed an opportunity for us, we can't let it go easily." The person who spoke was Zheng Zijian, whose father was the assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue. Among them, he could be regarded as a wise man. Cui Shixin and Zheng Zijian's words were soon agreed by the others. The reason why they came to the arithmetic college was that they were not valued in their own families. The future master of the Chen family was Qin Lijun, not Qin Lisan. The Qin family had Qin Yu and Qin Feng could not stand out. The Cui family naturally had nothing to do with Cui Shixin. Although they had powerful families behind them, they still had to fight for their own future. As for Zheng Zijian, although he was the eldest son of the Zheng family, the Zheng family was just a new family in the capital city. More than 10 years ago it was involved in a big case. All the men of the eldest branch were killed, and the women entered the musical house. The second branch gradually rose in recent years because of the relationship with the king of Shu. One person gritted his teeth and said, "Even if there is a conspiracy, we are not necessarily afraid of him. The matter of checking the accounts is sensitive. If he really does something, His Majesty will not spare him." Qin Lisan nodded and said, "Yes, we might as well go and have a look. If there is really something fishy, then he is courting death." Everyone readily agreed, and there was no longer any worry in their hearts. You're tuning in to the Sword Dance in the Vast Sky YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.